Yesterday, Mr. Speaker, before the Prime Minister decided to delay his own withdrawal bill, he promised to maintain... Let me finish. Decided to delay his own withdrawal bill. If you care to look at Hansard, you'll see what it says. He promised to maintain environmental, consumer and workers' rights. Why then did the Prime Minister have these commitments removed from the legally binding withdrawal agreement?
Mr. Speaker, I don't think we could have been clearer yesterday in our commitment to have the highest possible standards for workers' rights, for environmental standards, and indeed I think one of the things that brought the House together was the knowledge that as we go forward and build our future partnership with the EU, it will always be open to members on all sides of the House to work together to ensure that whatever the EU comes up with, we can match and pass into the law of this country. And that, I think, commanded a lot of support and a lot of assent across the House. And I must say I find it peculiar that he now wants this bill back, because he voted against it last night, and he whipped his entire Labour Party against it. And I think it was a remarkable thing that the House successfully defied his urgings and approved that deal. What I think we would like to hear from him now is his commitment to getting Brexit done. That is what the public want to hear. And I'm afraid, Mr. Speaker, they are worried that all he wants is a second referendum.
Jeremy Corbyn.
The Prime Minister doesn't answer the question I put to him, which was about environmental, consumer and workers' rights. And I'm not surprised because... I'm not surprised, Mr. Speaker, because he once said employment regulation was backbreaking, and he voted for the 2016 Anti-Trade Union Act, which stripped away employment protections, and the provisions in the bill offer no real protection at all. Yesterday, in the withdrawal agreement bill debate, the Prime Minister pledged that the NHS was safe in his hands. If that's the case, will he be backing our amendment today, which would undo the very damaging privatisation so much of our NHS?
Mr. Speaker, I think I must say he's showing complete ignoratio elenchi, as we say, complete failure to study what we actually passed last night in that historic agreement. It is very, very clear that it is open to this House to do better where it chooses on animal welfare standards or on social protection, as indeed this country very often does. We lead the way. We are a groundbreaker. We are a groundbreaker, Mr. Speaker. We are a groundbreaker in this country, and I'm afraid to say that the Right Honourable Gentleman has no other purpose in seeking to frustrate Brexit than to cause a second referendum. As for the NHS, Mr. Speaker, as for the NHS, this is the party whose sound management of the economy took this country back from the abyss and enabled us to spend another £34 billion on the NHS, a record investment, and Mr. Speaker, as I promised on the steps of Downing Street, to begin the upgrade of 20 hospitals, and as a result of the commitments this country is making, this government is making, 40 new hospitals, Mr. Speaker, will be built in the next 10 years. That is this party's commitment to the NHS.
Order, Mr. Russell Moyle, you are an incorrigible individual, yelling from a sedentary position at the top of your voice at every turn. Calm yourself, man. Take some sort of soothing medicament from which you will benefit. Mr. Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 2 questions, and we're still waiting for an answer. Although we could do with a translation of the first part of his response. I hate to break it to the Prime Minister, but under his government and that of his predecessor, Privatisation has more than doubled to £10 billion in our NHS. There are currently 20 NHS contracts out to tender. And when he's promised 40 hospitals, he then reduced that to 20, and then it turns out that reconfiguration is taking place in just 6 hospitals. And so these numbers keep tumbling down of his unfunded spending commitments that he liberally makes around the country. The Prime Minister continues to say that he will exclude our NHS from being up for grabs in future trade deals. Can he point to which clause in the withdrawal agreement bill secures that?
Mr. Speaker, I must say to him that he is completely wrong in what he says about privatisation of the NHS, and I must resist this, because those 40 new hospitals, those 47,000 extra clinical staff, including 17,000 nurses, they weren't paid for out of private funds, Mr. Speaker. They were paid for by the NHS. The reason we're able to pay for them is because this party and this government believes in sound management of the economy, not recklessly putting up corporation tax, not recklessly wrecking the economy in the way that renationalising companies in the way that he would do. And he asks about the NHS in any future free trade deal, and I understand his visceral dislike of America and his visceral dislike, and I understand his visceral dislike of free trade.
Jeremy Corbyn!
Mr. Speaker, I actually asked the Prime Minister which clause in the bill protects our NHS, and obviously there's time for him to help us with an answer on that. He should also be aware that there's no public capital allocations made for the funding commitments that he's announced. All he said is there's seed funding. I'm not sure what seed funding is, but it doesn't sound like the commitment that we were seeking, and it sounds awfully like private finance going into the NHS in order to deal with the issues it faces. Mr. Speaker, less than 1 year ago, the Prime Minister said, and I quote, that any regulatory checks and custom controls between Great Britain and Northern Ireland would damage the fabric of the Union. Given that this deal clearly does damage the fabric of the Union, does he still agree with himself?
Mr. Speaker, I believe that, and I know that this was raised many times in the House yesterday, I believe that the Union is preserved, and indeed we are able to go forward together as one United Kingdom and do free trade deals in a way that would have been impossible under previous deals. This is a great advance for the whole of the UK, and we intend to develop that together with our friends in Northern Ireland. But I must say to the right honourable gentleman, and indeed his colleagues on the front bench, that I think it's a bit rich, Mr. Speaker, to hear from him about his sentimental attachment to the fabric of the union between Great Britain and Northern Ireland, when he has spent most of his political lifetime supporting the IRA and those who would destroy it by violence.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has a habit of not answering any questions that's put to him. Northern Ireland will remain on single market rules within the EU on goods and agricultural products. The rest of the UK will not. As the Honourable Member for East Antrim pointed out yesterday, it does create a very real border down the Irish Sea, something he said in terms to a DUP conference he would never do. And it wasn't that long ago. It may be when he was trying to become the Tory party leader that he said that. The Prime Minister told the House on Saturday there would be no checks on goods moving between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. Yet yesterday, the Brexit Secretary confirmed to the Lords European Union Committee that Northern Irish businesses sending goods to Britain would have to complete export declaration forms. Is the Prime Minister right on this, or is the Brexit Secretary right on this? They can't both be right.
Mr. Speaker, let's be absolutely clear that the United Kingdom is preserved whole and entire by these arrangements, and indeed the whole of the UK will be allowed to come out of the European Union Customs Union so that we can do free trade deals together. There will be no checks between Northern Ireland and GB, and there will be no tariffs. There will be no tariffs between Northern Ireland and there will be no tariffs between Northern Ireland and GB, because we have protected the customs union. And I may say, Mr. Speaker, this lachrymose defence of the union, as I say, comes a little ill from somebody who not only campaigned to break up the union between Great Britain and Northern Ireland by his support of the IRA, but who also, Mr. Speaker, wants to spend the whole of the next year in a referendum not just on the EU, but another referendum on Scotland, Mr. Speaker. That's what he wants. This is a threat to our United Kingdom on the Labour front bench.
Mr. Speaker, I really do wonder if the Prime Minister has read Clause 21 of his own bill. The Good Friday Agreement was one of the greatest achievements of this House, led by a Labour government at that time. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister unlawfully prorogued Parliament. He said he would refuse to comply with the law. He threw Northern Ireland under a bus. He ripped up protections for workers' rights and environmental standards, lost every vote along the way, and tried to prevent genuine democratic scrutiny and debate. He once said the whole withdrawal bill, as signed by the previous Prime Minister, is a terrible treaty. And yet this deal is even worse than that. Even if he's not that familiar with it, does the Prime Minister accept that Parliament should have the necessary time to improve on this worse than terrible treaty?
Mr. Speaker, it is this government and this party that delivers on the mandate of the people. And I listened carefully to what the right honourable gentleman just said, but he said it before, Mr. Speaker. They said that we couldn't open the withdrawal agreement, and we did. They said we couldn't get rid of the backstop, and we did. They said we couldn't get a new deal, Mr. Speaker, and we did. And then they said that we'd never get it through Parliament, and they did their utmost, didn't they? They did their utmost to stop it going through Parliament. And we got it through Parliament last night, Mr. Speaker. And this is the party and this is the government. This is the party and this is the government that delivers on its promises. We said we would put 20,000 more police officers on the streets of this country, and we are. We said we'd upgrade 20 hospitals, and we are. We said we'd uplift education funding around the whole country, and even more than that, Mr. Speaker, we are increasing the minimum wage, increasing the living wage by the biggest amount since its inception. This is the party, Mr. Speaker, that delivers on Brexit and delivers on the priorities of the British people.
Order.